Assalamu alaikum and a very warm welcome to everybody. It is Wednesday. It is the 17th of June. We are almost since जिन्होंने अपनी मार्च में जर्नी शुरू करी थी of lockdown, it is now April, May, June. So 3 months into lockdown. Who imposed it earlier on in February. It has been काफी difficult बच्चों के साथ especially, but everything has a rhythm to it, everything has a feel to it, and हर रोज की ये गुफ्तगू रही है कि how difficult is the lockdown, how tough has it been. बहुत सारी mothers, बहुत सारी families जिनसे हम पहले भी बातचीत कर चुके हैं, एक ही रिस्पॉन्स था, एंड इट वाज अ वेरी यूनाइटेड रिस्पॉन्स कि हम एट ईज हैं, हम घर पे हैं, अल्हम्दुलिल्लाह हम अपनी छत के नीचे हैं, वी आर नॉट अ पार्ट ऑफ दैट रैट रेस, हम पिलर टू पोस्ट नहीं भाग रहे फॉर थेरेपी, सब कुछ ऑनलाइन हो रहा है, एंड एक बहुत ही कंफर्ट और एक बहुत ही सुकून महसूस हो रहा है. सो everybody has their perspective, everybody has a right to their own opinion, everybody's life is unique, everybody's life has its own difficulties, has its own set of issues, लेकिन हर किसी को एक मौका मिलता है challenges को उस तरह rally करने का और game खेलने का कि you can be on the losing side, and yet हर point के अंदर there's hope, there's determination, there's perseverance. And जब तक वो match game जो जिसे कहते हैं match point या उस जहाँ उस तक नहीं पहुँचता, उस सतह तक, तब तक एक जज्बा रहता है. So I think we should continue to have the same kind of feelings, the same kind of जज्बात. Be careful, stay at home, घर पे रहिए, जिस बात या जिस बहुत ज़रूरी कोई चीज़ हो तो उस वक्त बाहर निकलिए, अपने आप को प्रोटेक्ट करिए, अपने घर वालों को प्रोटेक्ट कीजिए. Yesterday we were in conversation with Fazli Azeem. Fazli is a self-advocate for autism, for people on the spectrum, for Asperger's syndrome. उन्होंने कल बहुत सारी बातें करी, बहुत enlighten करा, parents को बताया about support, about what it was to be not diagnosed and yet to be on the spectrum as a child. क्या वो feelings थी, क्या वो effects थे, क्या persistence थी कि he wanted to bring back the teaching vibe back to the family name, जो उनके घर वाले, उनके ancestors, they were very, very inclined towards, the teaching profession and enlightening and educating. So let's bring him back on the stream, continue our conversation from where we left off. Assalamu alaikum, Fazli.
Welcome.
Good to have you back with us, Fazli. So, बहुत सारे messages आए, and with mothers who were messaging in, I remember जब मेरी और आपकी conversation हो रही थी, you said that I want to be able to address special educators, and I want to be able to address doctors and specialists. And yet there are so many parents over the years who've become not through degree but through research and experience, they've become specialists in fields of their children, जो भी उनको different needs हैं. Yesterday we spoke about a lot of things, Fazli. We spoke about how you became a self-advocate for all those children and adults जो अभी भी non-verbal हैं, जिनको regressive autism है, who have severe sensory overload issues. And yet it brings me to one of those questions that I've been aching to ask you. In one of your interviews, you said that it wasn't until you were an adult, and you started emailing, You emailed Dr. John Vincent of the Canadian Institute of Addiction and Mental Health. Hey, what is going on? What is this? What are the genetic components? And so I want to hear that bit from you. But I also want to, so I'm going to break this question into two parts. The first part being, इस वक्त पाकिस्तान में अगर अडल्ट डायग्नोसिस किसी को करवानी हो तो वो किस तरह करवानी है? And once we tackle this question, I'll come to the second part of the question.
Okay, so Dr. John Vincent was leading a study of families from Pakistan and the Middle East area with a lot of prevalence of cousin marriage or sort of same tribe or same family kind of marriage, and which is a bit lesser common in the West because I think cousin marriages were outlawed probably 30 or 40 years ago because of the genetic component. There was a lot of research then about genetic problems that may emerge as a consequence of that. So but it still continues in our part of the world and in some other developing countries. So they were doing a research with the link between the genetics of autism and what genes may be responsible for a greater propagation or the greater prevalence of it, particularly in families with multiple numbers of people on the spectrum. So as I said, autism is not something new. It's been there for generations, and for people who have multiple members of the family on the spectrum, they can actually ask their parents or about their elders or people in the past who probably had similar behavior to them. So the genetics do carry on. There is a strong component. So Dr. John Vincent was actually attending a conference in Lahore or the Mayo Hospital for a psychiatric conference. So he surprisingly happened to be here, and I wanted to ask him if I could become part of his study in that. And I think he came to Karachi and met a few of my family members, and he also interviewed me. And so I even gave him like a sample for his genetic research from my blood. And that was interesting because there was a couple of other doctors with him, all experts in autism from different parts of the world. There was Dr. Mohammed Ayub from the Mayo Hospital, Lahore. There was Douglas Blackwood from the University of Edinburgh, I think Scotland. And they also, were very helpful in the sense that they helped me understand the genetic component and how to diagnose people in Canada. You keep in mind, he was a Canadian doctor doing research in Canada on basically Pakistani, Indian, and Arab families, were migrated there. What they found, I think eventually they published their research a few years later. They found a consistent mutation on something called chromosome 22 shank 3. Now, that's a part of the human genome, also known as the Human Genome Project, that has been involved with something called mutation, or some people call it evolution. When people become something different, they acquire new genes, they grow into their environment. So there's been a lot of findings emerging from the science, some documentaries even by BBC and a lot of other organizations about the findings of the Human Genome Research Project and mutation and how that affects how we look, how we behave, the abilities we have. For example, there's a group in Tibet that basically have a gene that allows them to breathe in a very low oxygen dense environment because they live in the mountains, and they possess that gene in the whole world. And otherwise, people who go there and visit them, they actually get sick and have to get these oxygen canisters to survive, or sometimes people die over there because there's not enough oxygen in the mountains. So that's an example of how important genetics is and that factor. So the interesting findings from that research when they published it was that that part of the genome actually confirms a lot of suspicions people had that you cannot stop autism. It's impossible. Autism is part of the process of life. When people become into, let's say, another variation of themselves, when people evolve, when their brains, their bodies, everything about them actually adapts and becomes something superior to what was there before, in order for the process of life to continue, for them to change according to their environment. So that means that some components of autism, a majority of it, there is no single gene that you can stop. That's why there is, for example, the Shafala Center in Doha, Qatar, funded by the Royal Family of Qatar, a lot of other organizations which are basically trying to find the genes of autism. Similarly, with Autism Speaks, the organization in the US that has put billions of dollars into funding specifically to find a genome for autism or genes that they can perhaps pause it or stop it. And they've been unable to do any such thing for the last probably 15 years. They've been trying very hard and they've completely failed simply because there is no single gene for autism. It's something that comes as an end result. Like a lot of things happen, and the end result, what you see, looks like something like the behaviors or the phenotype of autism spectrum of disorders. There's a lot of things that happen, and the majority of them perhaps are influenced by the environment, perhaps are influenced by genetics. We have evidence of that. However, food also plays a huge trigger. Keep in mind that the majority of kids who are diagnosed perhaps around the age of 2.5 or 3 years old, that's generally when the kids are starting the solid food. Like they're eating dalia, they're eating yogurt, they're eating Cerelac, or they're eating any other kind of children food, solid food that usually starts at that time. And keep in mind that that's the food chain that I talked about yesterday.
Yeah.
People put hormones in cows so that they can produce milk throughout the year. People use GMO super crop seeds that basically contain higher concentrations of pesticide so that the crop survives, and as a consequence, the pesticide may accumulate. So basically, that's the whole problem that people have from a philosophical point of view with electricity itself. The concept of electricity did not exist a few hundred years ago. That means people slept when the sun went down. People slept for their 8 hours or 9 hours, and they got up when the sun got up, right? And that's how life was. But now, because of electricity and a lot of these scientific innovations, will obviously have helped people, but they've also created a physical pressure on our genes, a physical pressure on us to evolve accordingly, to evolve based on our food, based on our circumstances, the amount of hours we sleep, the kind of environment we're in. Sometimes people are in, like, look what's happening outside because of the lack of pollution and the lack of cars in the whole world. Nature is sort of coming back to life. The skies are blue, oxygen and amount of air quality in Pakistan is the best that it's been in decades. Based on the measurements that people are taking as a consequence of lesser pollution, right? Lesser human activity. So sadly, the result of industrialization and the mass production of certain goods has led to different fallout effects that people are only realizing right now. Because again, refrigerators store food. How long have refrigerators even existed? Maybe a couple of 100 years, not more than that. There was something they were using, like literally, damp earth or soil to store their food. There was no fridge back then. So now the resultant effect of these things is affecting people's lives. It's affecting the genetics of it. And I'm sorry, I kind of lost track of the second question. What was the second question?
So we haven't gotten to the second question. I was a little uh, aware of how I should have my question simplified. So the second part of the question was adult diagnosis in Pakistan.
Yes, right. Okay. So with adult diagnosis, in the past, maybe 10 to 15 years, doctors were actually hesitant to do so because they call themselves unqualified. There was no examples of such. What generally used to happen historically in Pakistan and in other parts of the developing world is that children were diagnosed when young, and those children eventually became adults with the same diagnosis, or they were re-diagnosed based on their neuroplasticity and their improvements and challenges and so on. But it was very rare that somebody was diagnosed as an adult or later on in life. This only has happened, I guess, in the last possibly 10 years or so, simply because of people who were diagnosed either by foreigners, by people or experts from other countries who were diagnosing adults, or by people who were trained abroad in other countries who had familiarity with that paradigm and the procedures and methods and best practices to do so. But it was not something that was very common or being taught now. So I guess the biggest shift that's happened in the whole world, in fact, not just in Pakistan, has been that when a child goes to get diagnosed and the parents are sort of educated, well read, and they're sitting right there, and the special educator is describing the diagnosis and checking off those points. Suddenly, something comes up to their mind and says, "Oh my God, this is how I've been my entire life. This is how my parents have been. This is how my grandparents have been." So they are the ones who then get a diagnosis based on what they are seeing and observing. So that has actually happened across the world, and that has led to adult, self advocates who basically were diagnosed later on in life. And that, I guess, one of the first ones, possibly, I'm not exactly sure. There actually it was a person, perhaps 30 or 40 years ago, who's called Patient Zero, a person in the United Kingdom who was actually the first person diagnosed as an adult with autism, obviously just 30 years ago. And then probably for 20 or 25 years nothing happened, and only the last 10 years across the world there's been a huge shift among people who have been diagnosed as adults, but as a consequence of their own children or their family members being diagnosed now.
But
So in Pakistan, I think maybe Aga Khan University or a few others may have recently started to do so. But and obviously, you probably would need to see a neurologist, and maybe the neurologist would kind of take a scan and see if something is structurally okay, and then they would forward you to a person who does diagnosis. You see, there's another problem that we don't generally talk about in the media, and that is there's actually a lack of psychiatrists per million people in Pakistan. There's too few of them. Some people claim there's something like 1,500 people for the entire population of close to 200 million people, which is among the lowest amount of concentration of psychiatrists in the world. So Pakistan really does have a problem regarding expertise in these areas and psychologists and so on.
And yes, I read an interview of yours where you did go on to say that if we are one of the most populous countries in the world, then we will have more health issues, we will have more disorders, we will have a lot more things that psychiatrists and psychologists need to be able to look
The,
into.
the World Health Organization says that 15% of every country in the world, population wise, has some kind of disability or special need or challenge. 15%. If you put that into Pakistan's numbers, that's what, 30 million people minimum, you know.
Yeah. And right now there's a lot of, I mean, there is a lot of good work happening. It's slow progress, but we need to be aware of all the kinds of progress that we need to sort of bring in and bring better change. This is from one of your interviews, Fazli. You said, quote, "My whole life until the age of 25 years, I had only two friends and for short periods of time." The reason why I'm bringing up this quote is for all those parents, all those individuals who are listening to us now and who will be listening to you later on. One of the major things that I've seen in the last few years has been that मेरे बच्चे के कोई दोस्त नहीं है, मेरा बच्चा अकेला खेलता है, मेरे बच्चे से कोई खेलता नहीं, मेरे बच्चे को दोस्त बनाने नहीं आते, हमारे घर पे और कोई भाई बहन नहीं है तो मेरा बच्चा किसका दोस्त बनेगा. So, I mean, I have my own personal opinion on this, but I would like to hear your opinion because I have read your interview. Having said that, knowing that this is a recurring question that is coming up, and for some children who are aware that I don't have friends, how can you throw light on this?
Right. So basically, when I went abroad, I saw how people abroad, parents with children on the spectrum, how they see that, and that changed the way I thought or think about that, the process and this issue, and a lot of it kind of makes sense how they do these things. So what happens abroad and in the developed countries, is that they have something called a play date, where basically the child is taken into an environment where there are other children and they're actually not paired up. They're actually playing independently. So this could be a park, this could be a Lego shop, this could be a place where in somebody's house, maybe where there's a lot of toys on the floor and children are playing independently. And what generally happens is that there are some games and some things like, for example, if you have a game controller and some child is playing a game, then obviously another child could join him with the second controller. Or if somebody is making something with 1,000 pieces of Lego or some of the blocks, and obviously that child can only handle certain amount of blocks at a certain time. Now another child could just walk up to that child and make their own blocks, and eventually you'll see that those children are then sharing those things that they've created, they're showing them to each other, and sometimes they're even collaborating and cooperating on the similar structures, creating something. So this happens naturally because children see things and they become curious, and their curiosity allows them to then engage socially or doing something that they both like doing together, right? And these as interests only emerge naturally biologically. They can be forced upon the children. It happens organically, but it has to happen in a physical space where the children are there together, where they're not being interrupted, or maybe the parents are just sitting down and in the background and just allowing them to do their thing. But these structural design activities happen in a conscious manner. So some people call this learning through playing or learning by playing. So you basically play with your child, and you technically are teaching your child, but the child actually thinks that he's playing and he's happy, and he sees the emotion in your face of happiness. Because sometimes when children are teaching their kids, sometimes when parents are teaching their children like homework and other things that they themselves don't like doing, like mathematics or something, they make this face that oh, it's so hard, and so the child can read the face very very easily, and they can bounce back those emotions. So if you don't show excitement, if you don't show happiness, your children are not they catch on very fast visually, so they can get the emotional sort of understanding of what's going on and try to reciprocate that. So that's something that doesn't happen as often in our part of the world that I've seen. That does happen abroad. These sort of design play activities that encourage engagement among children, and this automatically, based on similar interests, leads to a lot more. Now, this actually happens with adults too abroad, and I've seen it. I really have not seen anything that commonly similar to in Pakistan or in other parts here. But something that happens abroad is the concept of convention or an expo, and not for business purposes, but for some kind of a fandom that, as I mentioned in the last session, Star Trek, Star Wars, comics, computer games, things were more towards edutainment or entertainment perhaps, and people who are fans or like that kind of concept or popular culture thing, artifact, they actually get together and then they talk about those things. I've seen people who have not known each, they don't seem to be very social, have a 1 hour long conversation just on things that they saw in Star Trek episodes, while visiting a convention in the US. And then they exchanged numbers and they added themselves on Facebook. They even added me on Facebook. I was just listening to them. They actually, I don't know how they found me, I didn't even tell them my name. So that's pretty incredible. I'm just saying that. So these are conversations and things that we don't do enough of in our part of the world, possibly because those TV shows and comics are from another culture. They're from a different world, a different language. So maybe more localized content, as I said, the media has a huge role to play in this, could be promoted further so that, like, look at Enak Wala Jinn, right? A TV series that used to be in Urdu for the kids of Pakistan, and there's such huge potential in that. Why aren't people writing books on that story? Why aren't people making comic books on that? There's a huge industry. Look at the whole Harry Potter thing. A book became so much more, right? A movie and a game and so much more and so on. And people still follow that fandom. So I'm just saying that there are ways that people have done. Now, in my particular case, yes, I only had two friends, but I did mention in the last video that I also had cousins, right? And so a friend can go away, a friend can travel abroad, a friend can go get their education some other country and never turn back. But cousins tend to stick around a bit longer. They come to the family events, they come to the birthday, they come to other events and so on, funerals, all these other things. And yes, so my cousins in a way were my friends.
And you said something about well, you spoke at length and you mentioned play dates. Now, play dates started off as a trend about 10 years ago in Karachi, and I'm talking Karachi centric only because we live in Karachi. And so what started happening was that there were organized groups, play groups. When my daughter came about, I started noticing how parents started pulling their children who were different or had different needs. And that was one of the campaigns that I ran, that it's okay, some moms, you need to be more open to inclusivity. even if it's it's a group of five, include that different child, include the different mother, you know. And I think that a lot of parents from non special needs families have been very, very generous and very, very kind in extending themselves and extending the circles. And I can literally, there's so many mothers to thank for in just in my regard, who, you know, approached, came forward and said, okay, well, I'm a art teacher, how can I help? Oh, I said, wow, brilliant, let's have a art play date. Or you know, I can do music and I can do dance. And so it is slowly evolving. And so I think play groups are becoming better. I hope post pandemic we can continue to do the same. So Fazli, in a lot of your in a lot of your work, in a lot of your interviews, in a lot of your written work also, you have shown interest around laws. Now, we recently, I did interview Umair Ahmed from now PDP, and we did discuss the Disability Act and, you know, certain laws that need to be in place and revised and instilled, because yes, they are in place, but it's not like they are being followed, or they're being, you know, there's a mandate to register them or follow up with them. In your opinion, when you say we need laws in Pakistan specific to the autism spectrum, if you were to list a couple of things, what would those be?
Right. So, for example, now people are generally aware that there's a special NIC,
Yeah.
an ID card that can be gotten for a person with a special need. Now, I'm not exactly certain if that NIC card can have the word autism written on it. It probably just says special needs, right? Or it may say perhaps visual impairment or physical impairment. But I
It does
really,
now say it.
what?
So the children who have recently got their cards made,
Right.
and if the welfare department from the hospital said that this is Asperger's, or this is autism, or this is you know, whatever their need is, or whatever their special ability is, that is being written on the NIC. However, I
Okay.
know that there was some kind of an issue which was coming up with the NADRA, and I think they might have resolved it. So yes, they are putting, you know, the particular
Okay.
syndrome or the particular disorder. Yes.
Okay. Well, that's generally a positive thing. But can you repeat your question? There was some confusion regarding
Uh,
it.
so what I said was that if you were to see some laws being enforced for the autism, for people on the autism spectrum,
Yes, yes, yes. Right.
what
Okay.
what would it
Right. So generally, if you look at sort of a best practices scenario or what happens around the world, because we've gone through this process many decades ago, what happened is that a lot of people, for example, in law enforcement, now are trained about the autism spectrum, about how these people behave and how to engage with them, and what to do if a person or somebody tells you that this person has autism or some uh,
be?
Asperger's syndrome or some other communication disorder, basically. And I really don't think that training happens in our part of the world. I
Yeah.
really don't think that this is taught to people. For example, nurses who may come in, let's say, like a ambulance, perhaps, for emergency service and things like that. Yes, the doctors who are in the hospital and those people, they have like a single page in the book, that huge thick book that's taught to all MBA BBS doctors in Pakistan. I've seen that at Dow University, and that is a single page of symptoms. That's it. In the entire book, and those are sort of like drawings, behavioral symptoms. I've seen that. Beyond that, there's not much detail and research. I think Dow recently, maybe 10 years ago, started a whole center for autism. So they've done good training in the last decade or so, and obviously good things are happening, but not at all. Keep in mind, this is not happening at all medical colleges. This is not happening at all hospitals in the country. So Karachi probably stands out because of the population and the amount of trained people here. But again, this is not happening throughout the country, especially not in the villages, perhaps, or the sort of more rural areas and other provinces too much. So something that perhaps needs to change is that awareness of people who are service providers, not just special needs service providers, but also other kinds of service providers, emergency professional, nurses, perhaps law enforcement, and other people, perhaps even lawyers, who need to sometimes tackle issues for people with autism, because with autism there are some specific issues that are not there in other disorders and syndromes and conditions, particularly the communication challenges that happen because a person on the spectrum can be physically completely looking like a neurotypical and yet have that communication difficulty, which causes that 1%. It's that 99% there, but that 1% problem, and that becomes a problem for everything because of interpretation or understanding what the law is or how to follow it, and all kinds of technical things that happen as a consequence of adult interaction or your civic engagement with society and the government and services, and and so on. And then there's the whole issue of the whole disability and social services system in Pakistan that I don't think it's very easy to navigate. It sometimes requires a lot of help. That's where now PDP has stepped up and they've done a lot of services by facilitating that help, getting people educated, getting people trained, helping them apply for the special needs NIC and other services. So they've done a good job. Now PDP, of course, didn't exist perhaps 10 years ago. So this is a recent phenomenon, and I'm not sure how wide their range is. Perhaps it's in Sindh and Karachi. I'm not certain if they are doing the similar service, perhaps in Lahore or Islamabad or in other parts of the country. But again, whatever they're doing is perhaps good. Maybe needs to be emulated a bit more. As far as the laws go, yes, I did mention that a lot of the laws refer to disability in the generic sense, as in, they are wording such as, mental retardation, which as an absolute, so it's an obsolete term, really. It's not used anywhere else in the world because now they understand that sometimes neurodiversity also plays the role. Sometimes people on the spectrum are just fine the way they are. They just need a bit of help and support. It's not that you can make them into neurotypical because that's sometimes it's not possible. But they can live independent, happy, satisfied lives, provided that they have enough support from the government, their families, and everyone else around them, society. So I think what has happened also because you see there was something called the DSM. The DSM was a sort of a document by the American Psychiatry Association, and that was the DSM-4 back in 2012, and before that was used to diagnose people on the autism spectrum. Now, the DSM-4 had these four sort of generic categories, which were actually eliminated. Asperger's syndrome was one of them, and this was all made part of the autism spectrum of disorders. So the spectrum became very wide, and as a consequence, it became for people in the US, it became too wide because now they're claiming that every 50th kid or every 30th child is now diagnosed on the autism spectrum disorders based on that clinical definition, which was widened in the DSM-5, which came out around maybe 2013 or 2014 abroad, right? And obviously, this was a system that was created primarily by the pharmaceutical companies to have like a one-to-one correspondence, like one kind of problem equals one kind of medicine, that kind of sort of thing. So there was a financial agenda behind it because in the West you have the insurance model where people pay for insurance and the insurance pays for the services, as opposed to in Pakistan or in the developing countries where there is no insurance or the insurance does not pay for these services. You have to pay them for them yourself, and most of these are privatized, the good ones at least, which are very expensive. So that's a very different sort of model over here. So we don't rely on the DSM, we rely on the ADOS test and the other tests that basically came out of the UK, Cambridge-based models. The Autism Research Center, ARC, under Simon Baron-Cohen and his team over there. So what has happened is that a lot of these best practices are now being consolidated only recently, and among them is not just the law system's existence, but the implementation. For example, there is the law says that 2% of every government office or every entity, with the SECP or enrolled with the government, has to employ people with disabilities, right? And now, obviously, the law exists, but who implements that? Who enforces it? Who, everyone who checks on it? So that's the whole problem. I think the laws do exist. Maybe they're not. They're a bit generalized. They're not specialized. And the problem is the awareness and the implementation, which I think now PDP to some extent in Karachi has tried to make their change, as much as they can. And I think that's actually a sort of a bad thing because you see in the past, because Pakistan has so many challenges, the governments historically have sort of allowed the NGOs to replace their services. A lot of the services that the government should be providing, as they do in different countries, actually the non-profits are providing. Look at the ambulance network in Karachi. If the private providers like ED and so on were not there, there would be no ambulance service in the city. If the private transportation providers were not there, there would be no public transportation in the public sense. It's not owned by the government; it's owned by private individuals who are providing a service to the government. So this kind of outsourcing, basically, there are problems that happen eventually. Look what happened in the United States when healthcare became privatized. Look at the prices of insurance that have shot up. Like, for example, something like, say, a root canal, which costs something like maybe 5,600 rupees in Karachi in the OPD, maybe 10, 20,000, 30,000 in the private dental clinics in Karachi. If you do that in the United States, it starts at something like $3,000, which is, how much more compared to what it actually costs. And things like a fracture would cost you 50 to $100,000. That's completely insane. People go poor in the US if they don't have insurance and they have to get some medical procedure from some private hospital, and the cost goes so high. So these are things that you have to be very careful about when engaging with your own future, because eventually when privatization happens, then capitalism and profit over service becomes a problematic motive.
Yeah. And again, government services. The reason why there are so many private hospitals, there are so many private institutions, is because there is this deep black hole. I like to call it the black hole because it's that void, and nobody wants to sort of like talk about it, go near it. It's that unaddressed territory. And yes, our leaders are people who are specialists in the field need to have it out there so that there can be trainings and there can be so much more representation and awareness raised. Um, One of the things that we talked about yesterday was media and TV representation, Fazli. That in comparison to other countries where a lot of recently, I don't know if everybody's seen it, but on Netflix there was this film documentary called Miracle in Cell Number 7, I think it is, if I'm not getting the name wrong. And it is about a father who is on the spectrum and has immense sensory overload issues and is has the repetitive nature and so many more things, and yet he is a father to a child. And it's such a beautiful film. It's a Turkish film, and like you said, we are still waiting for Pakistani media representation in films. What do you think is the reason that there is no representation yet?
Well, one I think is the whole challenge of our population. 220, close to, well, that's what our government says, 220 million people. That's a lot of people. Pakistan is the sixth most populous country in the world. If you look at the physical geography and the size of Pakistan, and you compare that with our population, it's quite a problem, because we basically are a lot of people in a very small area. And then the whole problem of urbanization. Most people basically live in the cities now. They don't live in the farms or the other areas spread out across the country, and that causes problems in terms of water, sanitation, health services, education, all kinds of issues and challenges, where Karachi, I don't think, was designed to handle this kind of population. And now that's led to Kachi Abadis and all kinds of things which I won't get into, just so that people can survive and kind of thrive over here. And this urban, shifting from the rural to the urban has increased over the last few decades. It's going to increase as time goes ahead, and will just cause even more problems. Like sanitation, pollution, the heat problem, urban heat, climate change, all again. So there are just so many challenges that are being increased as a consequence of bad planning or no planning, or politicization, political gains, this so-called, low-hanging fruit that people use as a terminology, the easy way out, or passing the buck, blaming somebody else. for challenges now, blaming the past, not learning from it, is something that has exacerbated all these issues. And then you have the other issue of so many bright, intelligent, hardworking people from Pakistan not seeing the future in this country and leaving. The amount of reports that have come out last year to the amount of people who've left Pakistan, and
Yeah.
not because they had to, but because they had no choice. They had to get employment to make their ends meet, and they send that money to Pakistan every year, and that's what keeps our economy afloat. It's that money that the expats are sending. But what rights do the expats get? They are not allowed to vote. They don't have. I don't think they get anything much for what they give back to the country. And again, that's a whole other debate. Because the reason I put this forward is because this is exactly what happened in China. The Chinese people who migrated out of China 100 years ago to get greener pastures to make money, a lot of them actually send money back to their countries, to their hometowns, to their relatives, and it resulted in a transformation and education and technology transfer. The exact same thing happened with the Indian population and diaspora, that they left their country for better, I guess, income and a bit of a life abroad. And a lot of them came back, they returned, they invested in their country, and their country has developed, as much as they could manage. But as I said, a lot of that has to happen with the Pakistani diaspora too. There's a lot of people from Pakistan living in the UK or the US or other countries, and they've done pretty well. And they do want to help, do contribute back. But you see, you can't misuse that situation, because a lot of times we see that money comes in, it's misused, perhaps stolen or not used properly or wasted. And so, again, there's a lot of leadership challenges that happen in the developing world, also because you have a lot of people who are older, from a different time, and they're trying to run the country their way. And perhaps a young, you see, Pakistan has a youth bulge. We know that there's
Yeah.
majority of our population is below the age of 35, 60% approximately. That's what the estimates say. And as a consequence, all these kids are going to grow up, and they're going to be the leaders of tomorrow. And there's just so many of them that now I believe, I think even now the government is trying to engage them through social media or some other processes. And I think that's generally a good step. At least now their voice will be heard, because there's just so many of them. And we need younger people, younger leaders out there to represent us, to represent our problems, people of the culture, people of the language, people who are representatives of our population. So again, a lot of debatable things that can happen, a lot of questions. But I think generally, pressure of any kind brings change. The pandemic and the lockdown is forcing people to change, to shift their ideals, to survive. Best practices are coming in. It's just a matter of survival now. And
Yeah.
look what happened to Isaac Newton, the man behind integration and differentiation and all those tough mathematical subjects that we don't like in universities and so on. He created all of that when stuck at home in a pandemic a few hundred years ago. That's exactly what happened when Isaac Newton got stuck at home. He became creative, and he created things that changed literally the whole world. There's a lot of scientific revolution. Everything that we can attribute to can be traced back to that single event. If Isaac Newton had not been stuck at home during a pandemic when he was a professor at Oxford University, he wouldn't have discovered all those things and not shared them. He wouldn't have time to do all these creative, crazy experiments at home, which are people have written about widely. That never would have happened, and as a consequence, we would have been scientifically far behind now. As we wouldn't have sent people to space even probably by now. So I guess these pressures do bring about change. It's
Yes.
nature's way of.
And sometimes, if not many a times, good change, because there is a lot of good change happening. One of the good changes, um, I think, bringing our session to a close, we've spoken about so many things, we've addressed so many situations. Um, but I think I'd like you to close the session, Fazli, by addressing, uh, in this situation under the lockdown, If there are other um, adults on the spectrum, and if not on the spectrum, have different kind of needs, what can they do and how can they step up and become advocates for their and take it on as a role?
Well, if you look at the whole concept of the hero's journey, which is a structure that people study based on pretty much the monomyth and a lot of the philosophical history that exists in literature, that there is always a story of origin, also known as the origin story. And you see that among the superhero comic books and movies that we see, that everyone has a story. Everyone has a story where they came from, what made them who they are. And that, I believe, is not being shared by enough people in our part of the world, in the developing world, which needs to be shared. Your story needs to be out there. Maybe you don't need to use your name if you're afraid. Use an anonymous name, but do write that it's non-fiction and based on factual events that happen, because a lot of parents need to see these stories, because then they can connect them to their child and possible outcomes, and what things, the best practices that they can learn from these stories and activities, because a lot of this sharing is actually what makes people take risks, makes them do things that they did not think that they could do. For example, if your child hums music or is good at remembering different songs and so on, maybe their talent needs to be encouraged, and they need to have an opportunity to try out those things, perhaps with a teacher, or seeing YouTube videos of learning, self-learning these instruments and music and other things that you can teach yourself so much now from YouTube for free. There's so much free content out there. Some of it is also in your own language, not just in English. So I guess there's no excuse now, because internet really is not that expensive as it was. It's really become cheaper, especially after the lockdown. You have all these companies coming up with cheaper packages. So what has happened is, I guess you should learn and share, and especially share not for the intention of just helping others, but also helping yourself. By sharing my story, I was able to connect with hundreds of people across the world who were similar to me, or who had gone through what I had gone through. And I basically see them as equals. I've learned from them, they've learned from me. We've grown, on the whole, we've grown together. And that is the most important message, that you're not alone. You will never were alone. You never will be alone. There are people like you out there, if not in your family, if not in your culture, if not in your country, then people around the world. And they're waiting for you out there.
Fazli, I think there's a break. Can you? Okay. Around the world was the last thing we heard.
Yeah, so there are people around the world like you, who are similar to you, who are literally waiting for you to share your story, so that they can contact you and you can contact them, and you can learn and grow together.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Everybody has a story to share, and if one story can share many others, that those stories need to be definitely shared. Thank you so much, Fazli, for joining us, for giving us your time, and for sharing so much information with us. It was absolutely wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Take care of yourselves, and I hope to see you soon again.
Yeah.
Bye-bye. And that was Fazli Azeem. What इतनी सारी information, इतने सारे words. We are talking about so many things. Oh my God, look at my hair. We are talking about so many different things. Sensory overload. There's everything can be tackled, everything can be addressed, unless and until हम अपनी आवाज नहीं raise करेंगे, we cannot facilitate ourselves, we cannot facilitate others. So there's so much conversation ongoing. Tomorrow we have Miss Amna Siddiqui of Ziauddin Speech and Rehabilitation Services. Amna Siddiqui is a very senior a speech and language therapist. She will be with us. If you have questions for her, please have them in, because she is the one who runs the speech and language, Ziauddin Speech and Language Rehabilitation Center. And so उनसे गुफ्तगू करेंगे, उनसे बातचीत करेंगे, और we will wait for tomorrow. So take care of yourselves, and like Fazli said, रात सोने के लिए बनी है, अपनी नींद पूरी कीजिए, wake up fresh, wake up rested, and drink lots of water. Take care of yourselves. Khuda Hafiz.